It's time to continue the conversation, and it's my pleasure to welcome back Professor Kerry London to the stage, along with our eminent panellists. To further unpack the discussion, of course, earlier we were focused on the national and federal view of housing and the housing challenges and opportunities, and now it's time to turn our attention to the state level. So to further unpack the state perspective, we are very pleased to welcome Shane Bennett, CEO of Arden Homes, Kat Panjari, Director of Strategic Foresight and Partnerships for the Municipal Association of Victoria, and Sarah Toohey, CEO of Community Housing Industry Association Victoria. Welcome to you all, and over to you, Professor London. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. As Jo said, this morning we heard from the Minister, and really it was a lot about the federal and the Commonwealth approach and strategies to increase the housing supply. She unpacked the problem, analysed it, and planning system reforms, labour, materials, productivity, and I think the other one was finance, investment and financing. So now we've got really three nice representatives from really important key stakeholders. And I think it's an opportunity for us to unpack the whole challenge around how we're going to get everyone to play together in the sandpit nicely. So what are the challenges and perspectives from each of our panellists today? And we're going to unpack a few of those things. So if I can throw to maybe Sarah to begin with. Yeah. You've seen there's lots of policy reforms in Victoria, some really significant and a fairly ambitious reform package as well. So what are some of the challenges that you're foreseeing or foreshadowing in what's been put forward? And are there any other levers or areas that you think are perhaps opportunities lost?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Minister this morning did a really nice job of unpacking each of the sort of components, and you could probably do the same thing with the Victorian Government's housing statement in putting them in those buckets that she did. The one bucket that is drying up, I guess, in Victoria is the financing bucket, and I think one of the challenges that the government faces, there's incredible work and really important work in, say, freeing up the planning system around activity centres to make sure we're growing Victoria or particularly Melbourne in the places where people want to live. That activity centre program is really, really important. One of the challenges, though, in the current market with interest rates and building and construction costs is that the private industry you can do all you like in the planning system, but private industry is not building if there's not market demand there. The beautiful thing about the community housing sector is that we're non-market builders. We don't rely on market demand to catalyse those developments. We do rely on state government investment. The big housing build has been a really important part of that for Victoria, and that is sort of winding down now. HAF is coming in, which is fantastic, but we do need to see an ongoing pipeline so that the community housing industry can really partner in those places to help catalyse the building in those areas, in the places we need it.
Yeah. And that pipeline of projects really affects home builders as well. So, I mean, what's your perspective on that?
It was interesting that, Sarah, you touched on the finance piece there. We're in the fortunate space of delivering homes to people. They say housing, but it's actually a home. And we're very fortunate to be in that space. You create your memories and your lifetime loves and children and the likes. At the moment, what we're seeing out there, though, is the mum and dads of the world, their serviceability has really come down. And the APRA part of it, where they put 3 points over what the interest rates are, has really stopped the borrowing capacity of mums and dads. So as much as we would like to really push down that space and say, we want to deliver all these homes, and 1.2 is a very ambitious number over the next 5 years, they just physically can't borrow the money. So we'd like to see that bit reformed to help us get the volumes that we need and mum and dads to buy the homes.
Mm-hmm. And that volume is what we were earlier talking about in terms of innovative technologies or innovative models as well. You can't really explore and experiment in that without that assurance going down the track 10 years' time. It's been 40 years in the making, but it's actually going to probably take us 10 or 20 years to solve, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a transportable homes business as well.
Yep.
And thought we'd be able to change the world with that.
Yep.
It's not any cheaper than the standard construction methods today, but we do need to spend time in that space.
Yeah.
And the R&D, not only for today but for tomorrow, is where we need to be. Construction is a very antiquated business currently, and I'm in it.
Yeah.
So we need to change that.
Yeah. Kat, what's your perspective from the local government?
From a local government perspective, I think the state is taking a leadership role in the way that the Commonwealth Minister talked about that earlier, and it is great to see the state coming out with a plan for Victoria. We think that's imminent, and there'll be housing capacity targets associated with that for each local government area. I think the thing about the housing targets, however, is that we've seen in other jurisdictions around the world where there have been housing targets that they don't actually increase housing supply. They send a signal to a market around the capacity that is in a particular location. But what we really need is targets around the diversity of housing that's required in our communities, so that we can have people that want to raise a family in the right type of home or want to downsize in the right type of location and age in place. And we want people in single occupant households to have a place to live in a community as well. And then there need to be other targets associated with that housing growth. So we need community infrastructure targets. We need places that are livable communities to live in, and that does require a pipeline of infrastructure, but a target for green canopy and open spaces and the community infrastructure and the schools and the communities that wrap around that housing. So whilst it's a noble cause to set targets, and councils are willing to adopt that framework, I think there needs to be a whole sort of policy setting around that, and it needs to be relevant for the metropolitan areas where we know that most densification will happen, but the rural and regional cities that we see that are experiencing incredible lack of housing for key workers. So there's just no economic development being able to be really propelled in those places without a workforce. So the plan for Victoria needs to be able to provide a policy context that's right for metropolitan Melbourne. We know that's where the urban centre and jobs and population growth will occur, but it also needs to speak to those regional and rural areas as well, where markets are just not able to make it feasible for that kind of housing.
Could I add a target of social and affordable housing targets as a sub-target for those municipal-wide targets?
Yeah, that has been a real gap. Councils are calling for that. So when the draft numbers were officially launched to sort of councils, the 79 local governments across Victoria said to us as the peak body, where is the target for social and affordable housing? There isn't a percentage, there isn't a figure, there is an overall housing figure over the next decades to come, but the social and affordable housing component is not part of that. And councils are right at the forefront of experiencing the problems associated with that shift. So for the first time, we're seeing councils talking to us about homelessness. They've never experienced homelessness in their communities before. It's now visible to them, right through to the gentrification of neighbourhoods where young families and first home buyers can't get a foot in the door because they are tied up in decades of home ownership of people that don't have mortgages and don't want to see a lot of change and growth happening in their communities either. So there's a social licence issue that I'd be keen to explore around the kind of change that we need to see in our cities and towns and suburbs.
And you raised some really other interesting threads around, what do we design? What are the typologies? What are the housing typologies? And are there different models, that can actually seek to help address housing affordability as well? And I know there's people in the room here, very much focused on that, or focused on cities and the development of cities. Had a wonderful discussion with Malcolm at lunchtime around the organic challenges that occur. You know, it's nice for us to have this plan, but sometimes things don't quite work the way that we, you know, plan them out. Intergenerational housing, you touched on that as well, and I know there's, you know, someone very close to me who's here today who's done a lot of work in that area too. So I think it's pretty multifaceted, isn't it, the problems? And once you start to operationalise it, which is what you're doing, these challenges surface. But have we a way through addressing those things as they arise? You know, that's the piece around collaboration, isn't it, and integration. What are your thoughts on that going forward? You know, how do you get your voice back to the right places to sort of begin to solve some of these thornier issues?
I can jump in. I think one of the key challenges for the state government is really around implementing their plan.
Yep.
And bringing the private sector, the community housing sector and local government to the table to make that happen. For those of us that have been in this space for a while, the plan for Melbourne and regional plans, they were excellent plans. They had excellent content. They just didn't have a governance model or a framework to implement them. And our fear is that here we are with the plan for Victoria about to be launched and housing targets and a housing statement being launched by the state, and we're still not clear on the development economics behind that, on what's actually driving the targets, and we're not clear on the implementation plan and what is going to actually bind community housing or the sectors to be part of that. So it's a real challenge for the state government, and we're willing and wanting to be a constructive partner in that. And then I can't help but avoid the conversation around the building social licence for change challenge, because we are seeing residents in our well-established suburbs that have all the amenity and have capacity to grow, but we just don't have the community buy-in for that kind of growth and change in the type of housing that we need to see in our communities. We don't have the community support for that, and councils there again are often at the forefront of that. When that development application comes to the chamber and there is enormous backlash at a community level to something that meets the planning scheme requirements, you know, is good development in terms of sustainable outcomes and quality design, and yet the community haven't been brought on that journey and that culture shift that needs to occur. So I think there's a great piece of work to be done by the state leading a kind of vision for the type of communities and neighbourhoods that we need to see to accommodate the growth and the supply that should be coming on board hopefully sometime in the next handful of years. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of key challenges there for the state.
Yep.
I was going to go back to Melbourne 2030, which was the one that preceded Plan Melbourne and was also great but not implementable. I think there's a difference in between what we're seeing now and what those two plans had, which is a state government that's committed to changing the planning controls around those activity centres to allow that to happen. So with Plan Melbourne, they nominated activity centres and then left it to councils to do the rezoning, and that didn't eventuate in the way that it needed to. So I think I am hopeful that the state government has an eye to implementation around this. But to your point, we see huge social licence barriers to community housing, and we're doing a lot of work in talking to people about what it is, what it does, what it means, who it's for, and that is slow grind against hard boards. It's a very, very difficult challenge and challenging conversation to have. But hopefully Plan Vic gives us a bit of an opening to do that.
Hopeful.
I wonder if there's any questions from the floor. Yes, I think we have.
Hi, good afternoon. Stuart Benjamin's my name. I'm from probably one of the few in the room from rural Victoria. Haven't heard a lot about rural today, and we felt a little bit left out. In The Age today, there was a really interesting article talking about some of the housing policy failures and unfortunately very few of the successes we've had in the last couple of years, particularly the 800,000 homes announcement. So 100,000 homes a year for 8 years, and then in our first 18 months we've only done about 50,000, which means by my maths we're now got to do 105, and by next year it'll probably be 110 in the remaining years. When 95% of the houses we build in Victoria are privately funded, and we always focus on the community housing, and if we could double that, we'd take it from 5 to 10, and that's unlikely to happen. How on earth do we grow the 95% to actually get those numbers up? And can I put it to Shane to start?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The numbers that were, the 1.2 million from today into the next 5 years, and where they're actually going to land those houses, puts a lot of upward pressure into our industry. We don't have the materials, we don't have the labour, and we'd be battling to deliver that if we did. So the inflationary pressure on that would be enormous, and that scares me. The thing about the regional part of it, there's not the jobs out there for the people in the regions. I'm from country Victoria originally, out in the Western District, and farming background. We used to have people that worked on the farm, and we employed workers and had people driving tractors and headers and the likes. Today we don't do that. So the little country towns really do suffer, and it's getting jobs back into those country areas that then can provide the wages to be able to borrow the money to build a house or support that community. We look at it as Melbourne as a whole. We were always taught when I grew up was if the country was going well, the city would be going well, because the people in the country would go in town and buy a new car or a new, whatever it was. So we really do need to focus in those rural and the regional areas. That's where we can get the housing affordability. But there's not a real a clear plan that I can see at this stage. But yeah, you're right. We need to focus in those areas. I'm not sure whether that answered it or not.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I was going to yell, but I'll use the microphone. I have a question about how we should be thinking about the structure of demand for housing, and thinking in particularly about the structure of immigration at the moment. It is mainly temporary, students, backpackers, workers, but they're not necessarily here permanently. So how should we be thinking about housing supply and housing planning when a bigger proportion of those demanding housing need it for temporary purposes rather than permanent over a whole lifetime?
Who wants to field that?
I do think that is, again, the kind of opportunity in a plan for Victoria to guide where that kind of housing needs to go. So it needs to be part of a settlement strategy so that jobs, industry and migration line up with the housing diversity that needs to happen at a local level. So I think there has been a policy vacuum in a state and a local context around where that migration should be directed and the type of housing that's required to meet that demand, which we have seen drop off. But there's also the misperceptions in the community about what that demand is generating, and people are missing out on homes because of the migration. I think the benefits of migration into communities is much greater in terms of the economic benefit that those migrants bring to our communities. We know that at a local level, and we know that regional Victoria would seriously struggle with a workforce if the migrant population weren't directed to those communities. So I think it does require a settlement plan, and there has been a real gap in that at a local level. So state government direction on that would be welcomed, so that we can ensure it is directed to the right areas. It's hard to do that at a very local level. It's hard to have a role in a macro sense without state and federal governments working together on that. Yeah.
I think we have a question behind you.
Yeah, hi. My name's Rob Pradlin from Housing All Australians, and we're engaged with the private sector to get them part of the solution to this housing crisis. And with regard to rural Australia, I talk to many businesses, and our rural areas are slowly declining because they can't find housing for, when I say essential workers, all workers. So it's actually a hiding to nothing as to where we're going. And I spoke to an abattoir in Queensland that say they're only 60% efficient because they can't find housing to attract its workers. This is a GDP issue as well as a societal issue, and there's no real clear answer to the essential worker issue that regional Australia faces, where our community housing providers are fantastic, but they don't exist everywhere because some of these rural areas don't have community housing providers. So how do we try and address that issue?
I'm going to muck up the name, the acronym, but NEMA, which is Tourism Northeast. So it's that bright alpine region. They've come together to do a key worker housing model because of the pressures, and it's a sort of three-pronged model. There's a how do you source funding for something on site, say on a vineyard where you need seasonal workers? How do you fund accommodation there? How do you, as a town, band together to fund housing through employers and potentially have people coming in and out of those houses connected to employment? They're working really hard on getting that model up and running. There's some seed funding questions around that, and there's some who runs it questions that we've been in conversations with them. So there's I think that actually regional Victoria is doing some really interesting thinking out of necessity. But there are some good partnerships happening there with employers and local government in regional towns to address those skill shortages, because it's a bit of a nightmare when Apollo Bay can't get a kindergarten teacher it just erodes the community overall.
There are some great examples. I might add to the Surf Coast Shire. There is a community organisation that has come together, and council sold the land to this community provider for $1. It's a prime piece of land in Winchelsea. That community provider now has under construction 15 homes for people downsizing in their community and ageing in place. And so they've been through an expression of interest process and have been inundated with community members who want to sell their homestead or sell their large home in the town so that they can move into this development. So councils are trying to catalyse development where they can, but it is often at last resort because the market is not providing that housing context. So more incentives for councils and other providers to be in that space would be welcomed. And I think we need to see these sort of models succeed and get behind them so that we can showcase those as case studies of being able to do. And then hopefully the private sector realise that development is worthwhile and feasible to a certain extent in those areas. Yeah.
Because it does need a bit of a shift in a whole range of things. Because I have spoken to Bess in Tourism Northeast, and they did a survey of Australian workers that want to work in regional areas. 82% want their house and their job packaged together. That is a different way to actually advertise a job.
Or a very old way, because that's what they used to do with teachers.
I agree. So it really does require different thinking in a whole range of areas.
Yeah.
Alan.
Just Kat, regarding your comments on community attitudes being difficult at local level and the social licence issue, so on, for doing new things about housing, just what's your general attitude to the state government and the comment we touched on a bit more, please, on general attitude to the state government coming in with overrides and more, and Commonwealth also, as we heard today. I mean, on one hand, it seems to me in some ways that would crash through. On the other hand, I suspect there are hazards and the community opposition would still... But just any thoughts on this?
I've got big thoughts on it. Because councils are at the forefront of it. And I have to say, it feels like now more than ever it's an important time to be having evidence-based, reasonable conversations in communities about change that is likely and needs to happen, because communities are increasingly polarised and any kind of change feels like it's being weaponised for political gain, and there's a real risk to I think, community cohesion in tackling these big issues if we don't do it with the right evidence base and with an informed approach. So whilst, again, I reiterate that council support targets from both the Commonwealth and the state as really important policy markers, this cannot be imposed on communities. It has to be done with communities and with councils who can generate that kind of community support, as their councillors and colleagues and staff and planning officers are right at the forefront of that change. But we need an education piece. We need to sell the benefits of that change happening in communities, because there's real fear and risk in people losing their amenity, this overcrowding. My neighbourhood's going to be overcrowded. They're not seeing the benefit to their amenity. Having personal experience, I've just returned to live in Melbourne after living in Hobart for 6 or 7 years, and I live in the inner city of Melbourne, and I'm overjoyed with the increased amenity that I've seen in my neighbourhood because of housing development and high-rise development occurring. There's more life on the streets, we've got pocket parks, there's people walking their dogs in the neighbourhood. But I'm one of the very fortunate people that lives in a high amenity suburb. But I know the middle ring, that missing middle group of neighbourhoods, we've got a lot of work to do around selling the benefits of change to those communities. And unless we have that pipeline of infrastructure in place, that pipeline of transport, and the equity lens around the pipeline of the type of social and affordable housing we want to see for all, it's a really difficult challenge. But I would say it's a kind of core principle of our foundations of democracy to have people involved in what's important in their neighbourhoods, and there's a way to cut through that. I'll stop talking about social cohesion and community
It's
development.
a time thing though, isn't it really? Like if you look, I've spent 10 years with Stockland and in Sydney, and on the boardroom, there's pictures of Hyde Park with a picket fence and single-storey houses around it. Now, over time, and if you look across through Europe and you look through America, and over time we densify, we go up, because we can only go so far before we run out of water, food, and the social amenities we need. So then we start to densify and start to go up. We're sort of a very young country, really, but we're starting to do that. And as you said, the people who have a 700 square metre block or whatever it was, over time, the norm's now 400. Or it's a 300 or it's a 200, and then we start to go up. So it's just an age thing, I think, but it's an educational shift for people. So it's we've got a lot of work to be done in that space for sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Iris from Oricon. 75 million tonnes of waste is what we create in Australia a year from all our residents. What are we doing about circular economy and bringing that back into the housing market to create these communities of the future?
Yeah, fantastic question. As an industry in the residential housing sector, we're very poor at recycling, and our waste is in the tonnes per site. The group I'm with, we're owned by a Japanese consortium, and they build 7,000 plus widgets a year in Japan, and they bag and tag their waste and they count it in kilos, and they work with the suppliers, and it's a supply-led industry in Australia we have a supply-led industry whereby if I wanted to build a house today, I'll go to Bunnings and I'll buy a 4 metre piece of wood, and I might only need 3 metres of that, and I'll cut a metre off and throw it away. Over there they'll ask for a 3 metre and they'll get 3 metres delivered. So at the moment we need to change that around because our waste is enormous. It has a massive impact on our sustainability as an entire industry in the construction space. But you're right, we are very, very poor at it. We need to fix it. We've got a long way to go, and it frightens me how little we do today.
Any more questions from the floor? Oh, we could... The first question here is interesting. It's a big, broad question. This is very complex. To get started, what's the one thing we should get on with today? It's almost like that would be the end question, but anyway, let's see.
I mean, I would say this, but it is a clear annual funding pipeline for the growth of social housing, because I think that catalyses a lot of other things. So, I mean, I wish that we were at 5% of all building at the moment. Victoria's social housing stock's 2.9% of all stock. And historically, so up until the mid-90s, publicly funded construction was about 6% of all construction. Between the mid-90s to the GFC, that fell to between 1% and 2%. And then between the GFC and COVID, that was down under 1%. So the kind of diminution of government investment in the housing market has had a big effect on the way that market functions. And to start turning that around, we do need to start changing the level of investment that we're making in the social housing sector. And that will have benefits not just for the people who end up living in those homes, which is a very, very important benefit, but for actually to put a floor under the building industry in terms of knowing what's there through those market fluctuations in demand. So that was my one thing. It's a clear annual funding and a return to a funding compact between the state and federal government, where it is $1 from the states and $2 from the Commonwealth. And that's historically what the funding mix has been, but changed under the Rudd government and led to state governments disinvesting. So we really do need to return to a very clear national compact about how the state, Commonwealth and state play a role in funding social housing.
And it's that certainty, isn't it? Not just for this year and next year and the year after, but it's actually decades, isn't it?
It's absolutely. I outlined, where did I start? Mid-90s, and the decline had happened before then. It is that long-term investment. And I think having a clear funding pipeline for the social housing sector makes us a better partner for private industry as well, because we face this issue of, we'll bid in for a funding round. It'll take 9 months for, the funding's open for 3 months and then there's a 9-month decision window. The opportunity in the private market is well past by the time we can come back and say, actually, yes, please, we would like to buy those things that you're building. So we do need a different method of procurement that helps that investment facilitate delivery by the private market as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Kat, did you have any thoughts on what that one silver bullet might be?
Oh, it's not a silver bullet because it's far too complex for that. But one thing that I know would make a massive difference for local governments across Victoria is a fairer infrastructure contributions reform to be introduced. So at the moment we have this very hodgepodge approach to development contributions and infrastructure contributions and individual agreements with developers at a local council level. So we need a reformed system that is fairer, easier to navigate, and is hypothecated to the place where that potential zoning uplift can occur and should occur. At the moment, councils in the rate-capped environment that they're in, and we all enjoy sort of lower rates, but that means that councils can't raise the revenue that they need to invest in that enabling development infrastructure that can catalyse development, or the community social infrastructure that they need to, create connected and livable communities. So a much fairer infrastructure contribution scheme that shares the load between the development that occurs as well as the state and the local government would go a long way to put those enabling factors in place to catalyse development, because we know that when that kind of consistent funding model is in place, there's a level of certainty for the development sector where councils can direct where that development can occur if they can align it to their own infrastructure that they might be working on and leverage state funding to do that. So I think moving towards a better reform system would make a huge difference, but having the voice of the development sector, the voice of community and councils at that part of that reform process is really important.
Shane, any thoughts?
For my own sector, it'd be for the serviceability and to get APRA to remove their 3%, let the banks take on their own risk. They're big enough and ugly enough to look after themselves. They've got their mortgages insurance for the first home buyers. At the moment, that 3% at the lower end of the market, which we build for, really creates an inequality, because at the top end, we can afford to do the business and we borrow the money. It's just the cost of doing business at 3%. But at the moment, for the bottom end of the market, first-home buyers and the young families, they just can't afford to borrow the money they need. So it'd be get rid of that 3% out, let the banks factor in their own risk, and see if the market kicked on from there.
It's almost like punishing, isn't it?
It is. It's the regulatory body is putting a 3% buffer on top of an industry that already has risk built into it. We have our own risk ratings, and if you don't have your 20% deposit, you go lender's mortgage insurance. So they've already factored that in. And then there's a serviceability on top. So it is really, it's two-speed economy, or, it's not ideal for us.
Yep. Mm.
Sorry for any bankers out there.
Yeah.
You're making enough money, you should be okay.
We've got an interesting question about Airbnbs. I'll float it with you. What impact do short-term rental platforms like Airbnb have on housing availability for long-term residents in tourist-heavy areas and, for example, the Mornington Peninsula? Anyone thoughts on that?
Well, huge.
Short answer.
The short answer is absolutely. That's sort of made a disruption in those tourist-heavy markets, and so the challenge is, to get the workers in the local cafe to service the tourist industry. You've got a bit of a tension between the long-term rental for those groups and the short-term rental for the people coming in. It's a pretty vexed issue. I know that I'm going to throw to Kat because I know that councils have views in those areas.
Yeah, it's a massive issue for local governments who are grappling with it, and I know the state has just introduced a tax on Airbnb properties to try to seek a kind of return to long-term rental investment. One of the things that we talked about earlier actually was that a lever could be for the state government to exempt houses that do go back into the long-term rental market from a land tax for a period of time. Like, I think there definitely needs to be an overcorrection to try to move away from people who want to put their properties on Airbnb. I think a tax at a state level probably isn't going to dissuade them enough, but we'll see what the impact of that is. But it is impacting on key worker housing, particularly in those tourist-heavy areas, so much that I think there need to be different incentives as well as the disincentives through the taxes that have been introduced. But, yeah, we've seen models around the world where there's just an absolute cap on those and there's no new rental properties able to receive a licence to be able to do that. But yeah, I'm interested to think with this, to try to do some thought leadership with the state government around the incentives that they could put in place as well to bring back long-term rental. Yeah.
Any questions from the floor? No? Okay, I'll take another one. This is interesting. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Any good precedents? Any good precedents to the housing affordability problem? Short answer is no.
I think
oh dear.
You don't actually have to go that far. Post-war Australia experience, you have to go back in time a while, but you don't have to go anywhere else. Post-war Australia faced a housing crisis with returning servicemen. It faced a skills shortage. It faced a whole lot of housing challenges that we have today. And federal government stuck its shoulder to the wheel and built a significant amount of housing. And actually, again, that housing investment by the state government catalysed other industries. So AV Jennings started off as a state government builder. So there's precedent in our history that we can look to for ways in which we did that. Now, people don't like necessarily going back because we want to look forward, but actually there's some pretty good structural pointers to how we could be solving the crisis.
I wonder if there's any international precedences. Any examples that we can look to overseas?
I also think there is that cultural shift that you reflected on earlier around, the great Australian dream to own your own home, and, that may have well been the case some decades ago, but I wonder if we do need a culture shift around long-term rental, and that build-to-rent model certainly could work towards that. But, you know, in other international contexts, there is a very different paradigm around home ownership. Here in Australia, we tend to see it as an investment opportunity, not necessarily your kind of just your lifelong home as it is elsewhere. So I think turning on those, the levers that we can around really long-term, high-quality rental accommodation that people can raise their families in and age in place in and not worry about an increase in rent every 12 months or whether they're going to be moved on, that has to be part of the solution, and that is part of kind of growing up as a culture as well and moving away from this investment model of housing towards it being kind of long-term home ownership. And many cities and countries around the world just don't have that same kind of, you know, they're shocked that we spend our lives paying off a mortgage and then buy an investment property.
Jump back into the fire.
Yeah, it's a really, I think there's a lot to explore in that space.
We've sort of been led to believe, though, it's a way of making our wealth too.
Yeah.
You know, it's the bricks and mortar. It's, you know, you've been brought up that way, and it's an old-fashioned way of thinking. But you know, it's still ingrained there today. And
yet here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah. How's that working for us?
Yes.
Not very well, is it? Not very well at all.
And it's interesting, you know, the last couple of years we've done a national survey around the quality of the housing market in terms of rentals. And it's quite depressing, the results of our study, to be honest. You know, we really need to lift our game in a lot of aspects, you know, around the rental market. This one's an interesting one. The Minister talked about collaboration between industry, local, state and federal government to address this issue. And we've talked about collaboration, and it's going to happen by alchemy or somehow. How would you each describe your current levels of collaboration?
On a scale of 1 to 10?
Good question. Whoever
0 at this stage, very low. We're not there. We're not there at all. Not at the table. The policies are brought out without any consultation, really. And they're delivered, and then we scramble as an industry to try to keep up.
To respond.
To respond to that, yeah. Yep. And that's as much our fault as theirs, don't get me wrong.
I think there's, definitely opportunity to do it better. I do take the point that the Minister made earlier on today about the federal government playing a leadership role. I do think that has gone a long way. And the fact that we do have 3 levels of government now talking about housing as their number one priority, that certainly wasn't the case, you know, in recent history. So the fact that it is a national, state and local government top priority, certainly from a government perspective, that's a good thing. We are still a long way away from kind of the sophisticated collaborations and partnerships that we could have in place. We've got some fantastic pilot programs and models. We have a partnership with the City of Greater Dandenong at the moment where we're piloting a range of programs, but we really need the state and the federal government to come into those pilots and actually realise the benefits of those. So, there's a way to go, but I think having a national and state leadership around that means that we all rise to the challenge. But again, it's about implementation. I go back to what's that governance model that's going to make that hang together at a metropolitan Melbourne or Greater Melbourne level, and then at a statewide, regional level. It won't just happen by having a policy in place. It needs to have a mechanism to actually deliver the plan and deliver the collaboration. And that at the moment isn't being factored in to our planning.
Yeah, I think we touched on this right at the very beginning this morning. So I think it's, you know, it keeps coming back to this. And Sarah, what are your thoughts on that from your perspective?
Well, I agree. I think, I mean, we really need the federal government and state government to establish the system settings that facilitate collaboration. So in my industry, there's a whole lot of collaboration because I think the less you have, the more you collaborate. So there's collaboration between housing providers, homelessness service providers, banks, funders, etc. So, but that's often done kind of against the systems or in spite of the systems that exist and the structures around the industry. So I think it's really about a great collaboration would be about how do we remove those barriers and roadblocks to really making those collaborations sing.
There's a particular question for Shane. I'll ask it in a minute. But there's the housing crisis in Victoria is a growing issue. And while there are programs for first home buyers and disadvantaged groups, older Australians with depleted savings and limited funds. What is the rest of the question? There is no question. I suppose what's the challenge with that segment of the market? Older, aged, yeah.
The structure of the Australian housing market is such that most people reaching retirement have owned their home or have done so in the past. But we are kind of moving into territory where people enter into retirement who are still renting, and that is a really precarious situation to be in. And I assume that that's what the question's alluding to. Like, what's the solution for that group? There's been a couple of pilots that my members have done, particularly around older women, so who've got a little bit of super but not enough to buy a house, who don't qualify for social housing but have too much. So there's some interesting models that you can put together, but it's about bringing those to scale. But for that cohort, I think it's a big missing net because they don't quite fit into the social housing system, or if they continue renting for another 10 years, they absolutely will be, but it will be a very hard slog for them in that time.
And it's a particularly difficult model to get off the ground where the cost of land is so prohibitive for developers in the private sector to come in and do that, the feasibility. But again, it's what those levers are. If council has land that can be, perhaps an at-grade car park and the air rights can be developed, or, that vacant land can be turned into some sort of a supported development, then I think we need to look at those models and encourage those. And again, looking at the incentives in the system to make that happen. So there could be some tax settings that could change at a state and federal level to support that and make that a viable option, because otherwise it's just going to end up pushing people further into the social housing market. And there's, not a lot of flex in that, obviously. Yeah.
Last question for you, Shane. On Shane's point that modular construction isn't necessarily cheaper, is it an option local council builders and CHPs are considering to reduce costs and increase supply? What are the challenges?
The challenges are the size of the factory you need to build them, for one.
Yep.
The challenges are then, if you're building a full modular house, how do you transport that into a community? There's a lot of restrictions on height and widths and delivering with cranes, and so there's costs in that space.
Yep.
If you prefab it and break it down into sort of sizes of shipping containers that fit on the back of a truck, once again, blocking off streets, access, craning them in, doing that. So there's a lot of negatives to entry.
Logistical, yeah.
Yes. So, but there are modular sections of the house that you can do, bathrooms, kitchens, and those sorts of things. So I think the R&D in that space, you can just pick it up and just drop in a whole wet area. The most expensive part of the home is your bathrooms and your kitchens. A living room is just the four walls with air in it, basically. So those are the most expensive rooms in the house. How you modulise that, how you bring those to site. Excuse me. Our industry is ripe for disruption. Yep. Whether we get something like an IKEA Homes come in and show us how to do it within moments, and we'll all sit back and scratch our head and go, gee, we knew it was coming, but we did nothing about it. That's the next brave frontier for us. At the moment, we're still doing bricks and mortar. So we need to be in that R&D space 100%.
Yep.
And I don't know if it's, printing houses just yet, but we need to keep investing in that stuff.
Yep.
I will shout out to the Shire of Dubbo in regional New South Wales, who have had their first 3D printed toilet block, which they had as a prototype, but they're now looking at some housing using that same, but again, relatively small scale, dipping their toe in. But I think a really important signal to the sector to say, at least we're giving it a go. We're wanting to test it out and get a start on this happening. We do need a disruptor in the sector. I think the Productivity Commission's report that came out just the other day really pointed to that those growth technological shifts and changes just haven't happened in the construction sector for a long time. So, yes, it's going to be an interesting space to keep an eye on.
It'll probably do me out of a job, but
Yeah.
it's okay.
Brave new world.
Brave new world.
Robotics.
Yes.
And I think we're probably at the end, and I think Joe is going to come up and end for us. Thank you, Joe.
Up for you, but thank you all for an absolutely terrific discussion. You know, I think we've certainly had a really wide-ranging conversation today, haven't we? Terrific to hear at the beginning from our federal minister, who I think gave a really clear and pretty insightful description of some of the challenges, and also expressed a real optimism for and explained the clear need for collaboration, particularly at kind of federal, state and local levels, and with industry and other aligned groups, of course. Interesting then, as we move into the state perspectives, to hear maybe some different views around how that collaboration, where we're up to in that process, and the need really for good governance and operationalisation of some of those intentions to really bring all of this to life. So certainly lots of great work going on as we all think about some of the housing challenges in Australia, and lots more to do to really bring some of the solutions to life going forward. So look, I will close this out for the day. Please join me in formally thanking our panel, Shane, Kat and Sarah, and Kerry, of course, for so ably facilitating the discussion for us today. Thank you. As always, of course, thanks to you, our members, for coming along today and for so generously sharing your questions and ideas. There's no question this is a really engaged audience. We had a lot of questions come through, as hopefully you all saw, and I think a really good quality of conversation today. If you enjoyed today's session, we've got an amazing program coming up here for you in Melbourne, if I say so myself. The team's done a great job. So on the 5th of March, we have a free event for all CEDA members, and CEDA is launching its new vision for Australia's long-term economic and social prosperity. We're calling it Progress 2050, and this will be really central to CEDA's approach going forward in terms of the issues that we're tackling and how we're really focusing on what we think those long-term issues are that are shaping Australia's economic and social development. So it's a really important milestone for us, both in terms of the issues we're tackling and the way we work with our members to shape a better Australia. And we would love to see as many of you there as possible. If you'd like to come along, it should be an exciting event, and free always is a good thing. Lots of other opportunities to engage too. Data centres are very much top of mind for a lot of people at present. We have a data centre forum on the 27th of Feb here in Melbourne, and on the 1st of May we have our 3rd annual Climate and Energy Summit, which we are holding for the first time in Melbourne. So we've previously held that in other places around the country. That should be a really good conversation with a terrific lineup. So with that, thank you all once again. Thanks again to our wonderful panel of experts, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Trust that you found it to be valuable, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.